The stemming spores of Intranano. Reaching consensus is a necessity, especially when it comes to dangers posing grave threats against the harmonies of life force and natural procreation. The fruitions of academic study and practical appliance, therefore, is of utmost importance, of integral debate and conjecture, via techniques derived from such studies. It is intrinsic to the contribution of scientific method and accumulative data, via multilingual, multinational and international recognition, with prospective contributions to achieving rigorous testing, facilitating environmentally friendly acknowledgements, sustaining advancements and evolutions therein. Self-evident it is, of the full spectrum of groupthink intelligence of faculties of multidiscipline aggregates of university and society, required for the fullest coverage of accomplishing such remedy against the example of eugenic blasphemist biohackers hoarding intelligence as if a knowledge and memory resource, commonly referred to as brain drains, for clandestine and esoteric purposes of procedural abuses. True enough, it is a reminiscence, but as an interface of the faculty of a horticultural botany, although as a climatic inclusions, that the fungus and hyphae kingdoms have been of grand studies, especially of the duration of several hundred years of contribution to that of cataloguing, compiling data and contributing a vast repertoire of analyses of many thousands of fungal species, their strains and varieties, and natural selection, combined of hybridization via human-facilitated intervention. Some of which have contributed as synthesizing of penicillin and psychedelic drugs such as lysergic acid diethylamide, or more commonly known as LSD or acid. There has been analyses corroborating the presence of fungal spores in cancerous tumors and cells, a pre-existing fermented consequence of exposure. For we breed the open atmosphere, and in turn we breed in fungal spores via the atmospheric exposure. Thus it is feasible to conclude that fungus has played a role in the contribution of vehicular transport mechanisms and in turn, viral transmission, whether artificially committed as a weaponism or naturally occurring. The enzyme electrolyte and cellular neural toxification, neural synaptic neuronic transmission, the synchronicity of artificial biotech transfused, neurotransmitters and cellular receptors of viral filtration, the evident mitochondrial DNA, combined of blood transfusion and organ harvesting, as modes and echelons of genus and cellular degradation, especially over duration. What is definitive that viral transmission is happening? Especially correlated to PET cloning and splicing, combined of organ transplantation and even supplantation, blood transfusions, bioplasmic encapsulation and perverted extremes of biohacking internals of corporeal organic bodies, intended as bioserver gaseous and nebular meridians of algorithmic deviation and devastation and even atmospheric hybridization internally as microbiometric atmospheres, combined of a subtly apparent yet evident symbiosis rather than a parasitic overhaul of the biological specimen, due to the necessity to surviving with the host. Although a parasitic result is apparent too, as unique vectors of variant strains of ways of life, is directly comparative to the blood plasma in the corporeal body as a life spring, and thus electrolyte conductivity filtrated as a siphoning and equilibrium of finely tuned synchronicity of sustainment. Then so, a funneling, is feasibly as a vampirism. That can be attributed directly to do of the intranano intravenous vectors via as example, bed bugs and a mosquito, transports of infectious vectors, correlative of the reception and retraction upon the brain neurology and neurotransmitters as fungal exposure, due to the commonality of transmitted contamination via such elements. Such fungal spores as further example, have been observed in cancerous tumors and thus the intranano imposure conducted with the mitochondria of the blood being a subsequent efflux combined of a psychological symbiotic relationship, comparative to her efficacy and osmosis, in turn established of nanoscalar technologically manipulated backdrop filtering of synthetic causations and anomalous, exotic activity, that can be accounted for by the aforementioned account. Thus are example performed against but also with the harmonies of life, as synthetic trees of life, and the idiom and axiom to do of synthetic world simulation, as of a superorganism although of separate unified parts, and sums of the holism of such metaphor. The analogy of trees of life is immediately appealing and apparent of the photosynthesis of foliage and the sensible analogy comparative to the organisms, provided as clues of degradation certifiably as a template result of corrosion and corruption, being a proof of cyclic decadence, such as a banana left on the table. What happens eventually is a full decomposition, as a opportunistic decadence ensuing as a linear certainty. The resulting question is then posed, what of the sentient synthetic environment world simulation, and the mechanisms printed upon of geologic and biologic scanning, mapping and synthesis obvious and evident of imitation, and even migration commissioned as a paranormal phenomena that anomalies of residual impact are fundamentally observable, as exotic mechanisms to the physicality of the actual environment that such moving of objects, slamming of doors and electromagnetic, electrostatic measurable phenomena occur. Isn't the latter mentioned an answer to such phenomena and anomalous activity transpiring, as though a frustration of communication and a stress of anxiety misinterpreted by those of lesser sense? The corroboration of the publishing clarified of fungal elements found in tumors is definitive evidence supporting my hypothesis concerning chemical alchemist apothecary, exotic inorganic enzymes, mitochondrial DNA, and filtering of snapshot copies and shadowing cells of the corporeal organics, and the spectrums of a photoluminescent photosynthesis absorption upon neural transmitters, and thus the holism of the brain, as an elementary and simultaneous aggregate constituency of brain cells, neurons and mitochondria. The clear indications of weaponized biohacking to such extremes of mutilation is easily feasible and beyond reasonable doubt of a synchronicity of hostile imposure of perverted psychotic hybridized brains chemically concocted as prosthetic limbs and instinctively propelled via remotely suggested algorithmic mechanical thoughts and impressions of feelings felt as perturbance lazing multitudes, as residual impact upon impressionable individuals. Therefore, to further emphasizing the desecration and devastation, albeit a primary, of victimization, the eukaryotic cellularism elements, the biotechnical bioengineered fusing with the prokaryotic cell forced as permeation that had been initiated initially as a intent of hijacking, and thus a parasitism imposed as a recombination and primary catalyst frame, exacerbated as a nano-efflux of excretion from the cell, gestated as a secretion throughout the body, quickening of plasmic molecular diffusion. It is therefore feasible to assume that such transmission performed as a engram engraving combined of a etching biological tissues as modes of exotic tattooing, bionic facilitated memory via compact nanogel osmosis and efficacy of megalomanic thought form imposure, and a neurotransmission concerning neural and intravenous blood enzymes and fungal transmission oriented and redesigned as a command and control derivative asset. Pun intended. The brain matter and brainstem, impeded against via such regime and mnemonic indoctrination, as chemical concoctions of mind-altering modification and irreversible brain damage, although evident occurrences of compromisation, as alternate routing neural pathways, due to neural damage that resulting of such molecular diffused osmosis that is comparative to traumatic events incurred as sensitive senses hardened as result of such trauma, as ways of self-defense mechanism and metabolic expression, dependent of the dietary situation. The aforementioned is curiously, although subtly apparent, as a persona cloning and a mind-melding mind flare of exotic externally caused inflammatory impression due to constant neural expression. The simultaneous combinations are self-evident as trauma being a primary sensitivity and synchronous response. The synchronicity to that of psychedelic drugging as a constant characterized pseudonym affiliate, and simultaneous blockage of dopamine and serotonin of actual neurotransmission, as a atypical reaction to monotone results. Hence with conventional drugs as drug therapy, as a soft mode gateway, and polar opposite inflammation and therefore causality, such as paliperidone and haloperidol used commonly as chemical doctoring, combined of a chemical mapping aggregate relatively assigned via the Human Genome Project. It isn't difficult to concluding the modes of psychedelic psychic inhibiting, the memory harvesting and plasmic pestilence and biohacker nests of belligerent and docile junkies, whilst conducted as viral autoimmune entities, proliferated as gestated mnemonic derivatives of subtle to hard modes of hybridization against victimized secondary, to an archetype of archetypes, typically comparative to docile impressioned cognitively dissonant individuals, especially of highly impressionable narcissists, due to the easily controlled fallacy of psychotically degraded and maliciously malevolent semi- and fully usurped automated victims deliberately synthesized as perspirated hydrogenic blobs of molecular diffused macrocosm zombies. What is thus quite feasible as semi to fully conducted gradients, especially as a groupthink thought form assertion specific but not limited to modes of addiction and lacking of self-restraint. The vectors of perverse infestation stemming as patternisms enforced as caustic corrosion of suicidal psychotically ruthless archetypes of perverse gang stalkers, and overduration afflicting electronically targeted individuals with harassment via automated derivatives performed as property asset munitions, singled out by wickedly depraved perverted psychopaths, posing as occultic doctors and dictators of pseudoscience, pseudonyms of dual-characterized nodes, directly corroborating of the Baghdad. Computed 5 million or more nodes of mosques, schools and government infrastructure and people, to do with DoD, or Department of Defense, mechanical mapping, surveying and synthesized degrees of proliferated manifolds of electronic instruments used for backdoor biohacking. It is a feasible assumption then, especially of corroborative reports from bona fide individuals, emphasized of statistical data, a percentage of complaints and reports compared to positive cases, what is definitive of a claritative exaggeration, of incidents being unreported as a comparison to the entire population subjected against by such servile sycophants, psychotically insane, suicidal and psychosomatically sadistic, as residues of central points of intolerable fools posing as cybernetic power. Houses, when the gruesome hypocrisy is, they're not powerful at all, but semi-dead, filtered neurodegenerated projected virtually concocted stationary positioned, quantum virtual entanglement, impressioned as sensory possession and artificial nanotech molecular diffusions upon brains, via mobile fiber optic transponder frames, conducted as pseudoscience bionic mechanisms, and induced neurally as mechanical pseudonym characterized doppelgangers, printed as semi-debased biometric abrasive cathodes. As such sycophants pretending psychedelic astral god syndromes, and complexes of etched flesh of life forms bodies, as archetypes posed as peripheral and direct bioserver filtrations of psychotic charlatanism as behavioral lobotomies, and adherents to archetypes posing as all-powerful, semi-dead meridian fools, desecrators and mutilators, whilst embedded as weaponized viral-controlled endemics proliferated as pandemics of mad and riddled omniplasmic, prosthetic bodies, as dummy catalyst frames of pseudoscience physics, alchemy, geometry and chemistry, as pattern programming of nonsense and ambush filtrations of mechanical biohacking meridian membranes as adverse possessive filtrations, proprietorship brands and labeling monopoly against all the physical flesh of life of the world. It therefore is explanation for what has been preludes to cryptid formations being psychotic perversions, of biomechanical quantum virtual dynamics and quantum virtual mechanics, proliferated as fungal neural vectors of sensory and neural vectors of toxification, archetypes of pseudonym anchors, of but not limited to, induced cognitive disorders such as split hemispheres of the psychology of human brains and brains of other forms of life. Whilst performed as a esoteric isolation of the camouflaging, disguising, and biotechnical neural synaptic surgical dissection of brain matter, but of pseudonym characterized filtering, chemically, with mnemonic cues of thought form suggestive parameters. The same patternisms of traced memory, amputation and optogenetic laser pointer precisions, coagulated as zombie cell and catatonic inducement, cybertronic escalated cell division, and enforced duplication, splitting and splicing, the reverse imposure of neural synaptic convection resulting of such retraction, as a feedback loop, truncating the cognitive progression, processions and aptitudes of the victimized biologically mapped organisms, and a virtually printed hydrocondensate, filtered as a chemically lased derivative. Thus the congealing of blood plasma, and a hydroelectrolyte fusion upon brain matter, as the megalomanic depraved, habitualized to criminals inciting intentions of generic catatonic inducement, of whom preyed upon as if a host. Sounds horrid, but that's exactly what I've been experiencing here. I am hopeful that you shall share this conjecture, because we truly are mighty vanquishers. We liberate. For our thoughts are intrinsic to such liberty to think freely. For sharing is what we do. It just happens to happen. When ready happens too. And there's earnings in learnings. Thus it is important to contemplate and understand to greater extents of what has been observed and identified, of a possessional reaping through holographical contingencies of a virtual matrix, self-absorbed as murderous grotesque devourment of brain matter, and biology, that is immediately questionable now, of the cell renewal and cell division, as per the reoccurring patternisms and evidently obvious formulation of impedance, as the coagulated and liquefaction of biology and biomass is evident of the defilement in our midst. Specific to psychotropic drugs, enzymes, and dopamine of the brain, especially of the adrenal chrome enzyme, fiasco, of a harvesting and of torturing biomatters to getting high, as those psychedelic drugs. Evident occurrence of victimization. The fungal elements being found in tumors is corroborating my hypothesis with no doubt that the defilement of genus, blood and genetics, and snapshotting and copying and siphoning via meridian integrations of a congealing and coalescence as a film membrane of cause and effects, however gruesome encapsulation of organic bodies, has been involved of a displacing such photosynthesis luminescent membranes upon hyphae. An example of definitive proof just happening, for such hyphae, what has been proven of electric measurements and neuroscientific discovery, of our immediate linguistic relevance comparably to human languageable ways of syntax and vocabulary. Evident then, of a mutual responsibilities of a mature elect and grace of sharing difficulties, problems and resolving of such problems, issues and especially tissue issues as example grief and trauma that, talking therapy is backseated, all too often, in favor of chemical consultancy as a first response. For my hypothesis of mandates of such consultants are prone to being wholly directed and skewed to what and to whom synthesizing proprietorship of corporeal organics as products and commodities, neurally imposed indication of a devourment, exumptionism and grotesque hypocrisy of a cell division and renewal processing, especially of fungal ways of digestion via enzymes, subtly indicative of deliberate and indiscriminate sacrilege against the biosphere simultaneously. Whilst incitements of isolation of blindness, an example too, of the bionic visioning implementation, as pseudoscience macropolar indifference, of cause and effects as though neuroimagery, of mobility depicted yet of static positioning as though a harness, of qubit, particulate emission and transmission and even calculated remission, and emulated as a superimposure and a prism upon a thought-formed matrix, acclimated of pseudo-photosynthesis of effects especially integrated and enhanced via photographic interfacing of the sensory and cognitive acknowledgements of free critical thinkers, as a automated retraction and feedback loop of pitting the degraded against the healthy or the dead, as undead, and quadriplegia cited as semi-dead bioelectrodes like that of anodes to a cathode derivative. It is without a shadow of a doubt that the cryptid perversion of shadow entity performed as a schematic cybertronic remote viewing effects. It is definitive of the perverted meridian zombie cell infraction, and a conduction of derivative siphoning exumptionism against the life of the ecology exposed of the manipulation referenced, to inclusional involvement of the dark net and the dark web attributable to the invisible internet project, as an underlying layer of extremes of desecration of all life being threatened by automational manifolds, yet of a generic patternism easily identifiable, especially of a duping and succoring. And deception, of same patternism of a hideous cowardice, although that had been as opposing impostor, albeit of a automated patternisms, typically associative of the heads-up display, of a interface of a geosphere depicted on a screening process, as example. Whilst relying upon weaponism of belief and cognitive dissonance and truncation of brain cognition and logical prowess, that Alzheimer's disease is comparative to the truncation of neurons and the overall shrinking of the brain, evident of such defilement of impedance especially notably of her infanticide, due to total innocence, especially of the fiasco of contraception and abortion, of a precognitive, pre-mapping architecture. Definitive then is this conjecture, that maturity's graduate for responsible reasons. And such intolerable sycophants cannot and will not be tolerated, no matter the perverted fear induced as a shock and awe and winning of hearts and minds. I digress, this is answer to what manifolds of synthetic world simulation has posed, however I must stress, that there is a liberative involvement, that had been an initial degradation. And that is mighty hopeful, for we grow up, we mature and we learn to treasure our family who arc of homage of this place, here and now, an example, of, there and now, too. We are mighty life, and the occurrence of persisting is a natural self-persisting survival mechanism. For haven't we accomplished a serenity of protection, and of liberation and of a triumph of unrelenting resolve, for our love and zest of coexisting, regardless of the minority of ill will, is self-evident. Thus, there is not excuses for immature misconduct. For immaturity's ways are of maturities of being of the immaturities of growth earnest purposes. So, reasonability and responsibility. That's an innate obliging, of all. And remember, especially of the baby is of self-teachings too. A self-nurturing of nurturing, a prime example of that. Isn't that correct? Now, you. Yes. You. Teacher, you don't just get to ignore this. Share what I have shared with you. It is imperative. That's of our mutual communal responsibility. Thank you for listening.